July 15th, 1099. The sun is beating down on the walls of Jerusalem, and an army that has marched over 2,000 miles through starvation, disease, betrayal, and battle after battle finally breaks through. What happens next is one of the bloodiest massacres in medieval history. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. The streets ran red, and the men doing it, they believed with everything they had that God himself wanted this. That single afternoon didn't end anything. It kicked off 200 years of holy war that would reshape the entire relationship between Christianity and Islam. And honestly, the fallout is still shaping the world you're living in right now. This is the history of the Crusades. Stick around, because this story has everything: kings, traders, warrior monks, and one of the most brilliant military minds who ever lived. Let's get into it. To understand why the Crusades happened, you've got to picture the Mediterranean world in the mid-1000s as basically a powder keg with 3 separate fuses burning at once. In Western Europe, you've got a messy patchwork of feudal kingdoms, kings and warlords constantly fighting each other, but all of them, at least on paper, answering to one guy, the Pope in Rome. And that Pope's political muscle had been quietly growing for decades. Meanwhile, over in the east, you've got the Byzantine Empire, basically the last surviving chunk of the old Roman Empire. Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian, ruled out of Constantinople, which at the time was hands down the richest, most impressive city on earth. But the empire had been getting chipped away for centuries, losing huge swaths of territory in the Middle East and North Africa to Muslim armies out of Arabia. Armies that had built an Islamic world stretching from the doorstep of Persia all the way to the Atlantic coast of Portugal. By the year 1000, even that Islamic world had split into rival factions: the Sunni Abbasids running things out of Baghdad, the Shia Fatimids out of Cairo, and the Umayyads holding down southern Spain. And then, in the 1040s, a brand new player crashes the party: the Seljuk Turks, a nomadic warrior people out of Central Asia who just converted to Sunni Islam, and they conquered land at a pace that terrified everyone. By 1055, they'd taken Baghdad itself and were running the show behind the Abbasid throne. They didn't stop there. In 1071, Sultan Alp Arslan smashed the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert, an absolute disaster for Constantinople. Seljuk forces poured into Anatolia and down into the Holy Land, even seizing Jerusalem from the Fatimids. By 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos is staring down the very real possibility of losing his entire empire. So he does the only thing he can think of: he calls the West for help. Here's the twist: Rome and Constantinople weren't exactly on great terms. Just 40 years earlier, a religious dispute had split Christianity in half. The Great Schism of 1054, Catholic West versus Orthodox East. So when Alexios's plea for help landed on the desk of Pope Urban II, the Pope saw an opportunity. Helping Byzantium wasn't just charity. It was a chance to prove Rome's authority once and for all. In November 1095, Urban II stood up in front of a massive crowd at the Council of Clermont in southern France and told the knights of Europe to stop killing each other and march east instead. But he didn't stop at help Byzantium. He added his own goal: take back Jerusalem for Christendom. He promised full forgiveness of sins to anyone who took up the cross. The crowd went absolutely wild, chanting Deus Vult, God wills it. But the first people to march weren't knights. They were peasants, tens of thousands of them, led by a fiery preacher named Peter the Hermit, in what's called the People's Crusade. And it turned ugly fast. On their way through the Rhineland, this mob attacked Jewish communities in cities like Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, killing thousands before they'd even left Europe. The whole thing ended in disaster anyway, wiped out by the Seljuks at the Battle of Civitate in October 1096. Before we get into the real campaign, the knights, the sieges, the empires rising and falling, do me a favor and hit subscribe and tap that notification bell. This channel is all about the stories history class glossed over, and trust me, the Crusades are just getting started. Drop a comment and tell me which Crusader kingdom you want to deep dive on. Alright, back to the story. The real army, the official one, set out in the fall of 1096. For major armies, led by some of the biggest names in European nobility: Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, Robert of Flanders. All told, as many as 100,000 people made the journey, funding an army that size was insane. A lot of knights had to mortgage their land to monasteries just to afford the trip, literally pledging their estates as collateral in a deal called, in Old French, a mortgage, a death pledge. If you died on crusade, you lost the land. Fun fact, that's where the modern word mortgage comes from. The armies converged on Constantinople, where Emperor Alexios greeted them with equal parts relief and deep suspicion. He made every crusader leader swear an oath to hand back any Byzantine land they recaptured before letting them cross into Anatolia. The campaign that followed was brutal. Antioch fell only after a 7-month siege. The Crusaders got in through betrayal. An Armenian officer inside the city quietly lowered a ladder in the dead of night. What followed was a massacre. By the time the Crusaders reached Jerusalem in June 1099, their massive army had shrunk to maybe 12,000 fighting men. After a 5-week siege, the walls came down on July 15th, and the massacre we opened this video with unfolded. Jerusalem was in Christian hands for the first time in over 400 years. The Crusaders carved out 4 new states: the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the crown jewel, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Together, they were known as Outre-mer, French for overseas, a thin strip of Christian territory, surrounded on all sides by much larger Muslim powers, and thousands of miles from any real backup. That constant danger gave birth to 2 of the most legendary military organizations of the Middle Ages, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. The Templars started around 1119 as a small band of warrior monks protecting pilgrims, and grew into one of the wealthiest, most powerful organizations on the planet. The Hospitallers began as caretakers of a pilgrim hospital and evolved into a serious fighting force, holding massive fortresses like Croix de Chevaliers. And none of this survives without the Italians. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa supplied the ships that kept Outre-mer alive, and in exchange, they got entire self-governing districts in cities like Acre and Tyre. This trade network went both ways too. Silk, spices, and dyes flowed back to Europe, along with something even more valuable: knowledge. Medicine, math, astronomy, philosophy, architecture, expertise the West had lost centuries ago came flooding back through these connections with the Islamic world. The whole system was fragile, and in 1144 it showed. Zengi, ruler of Mosul and Aleppo, captured the county of Edessa. Europe panicked and launched the Second Crusade in 1147, led by King Louis VII of France and Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III. It was a total disaster. Conrad's army got ambushed and wrecked in Anatolia before it even arrived, and the survivors made a badly planned attack on Damascus before giving up entirely. The failure of the Second Crusade went quiet for a while, and into that silence rose the man who would define the rest of this whole era: Saladin. A Kurdish general with off-the-charts political and military skill, Saladin took control of Egypt in 1169, absorbed Syria by 1174, and founded the Ayyubid Sultanate. For the first time in a century, the Muslim world surrounding the Crusader states was unified under one leader. On July 4, 1187, Saladin made his move, luring the Crusader army out into the brutal desert heat and crushing them at the Battle of Hattin. Jerusalem fell 3 months later. And here's the part that surprises people. Saladin spared the population. No massacre, a stark contrast to what the Crusaders had done nearly a century earlier. Europe was shaken to its core. The Third Crusade launched in 1189 with 3 of the continent's biggest names on board: Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, King Philip II of France, and England's King Richard I, the Lionheart. Barbarossa's campaign ended in tragedy when he drowned crossing a river in modern-day Turkey, and most of his army just turned around and went home. Philip and Richard sailed instead. Richard grabbed Cyprus along the way, then joined the Siege of Acre, which finally fell in July 1191. Philip went home. Richard kept going alone, crushing Saladin at the Battle of Arsuf and retaking Jaffa, but he never had the manpower to take and hold Jerusalem itself. The 2 rivals eventually struck a deal: the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192. Crusaders got more territory along the coast. Jerusalem stayed Muslim. At this point, the crusading idea starts spreading in directions nobody expected. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, not against Muslims, but against the Cathars, a Christian sect in southern France. It lasted 20 brutal years. Up north, the Teutonic Knights carved out their own crusader state fighting pagan tribes in the Baltic, a state that would eventually become Prussia. And down in Spain, the centuries-long Reconquista kept Iberian Christians fighting Muslim rule at home instead of heading to the Holy Land, hitting a major turning point at Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. If you thought things couldn't get messier, buckle up. By the late 1100s, relations between the Byzantines and the Western Crusaders had completely soured. Pope Innocent III called for a Fourth Crusade in 1198, aimed at Egypt. The Crusaders hired the Venetians for ships, way more ships than they actually needed, and they couldn't pay the bill. The Venetian Doge offered a deal: help Venice retake the city of Zara first. They did, and got excommunicated for attacking a fellow Christian city. Then an exiled Byzantine prince showed up offering an even bigger payday to help him seize the throne in Constantinople. The Crusaders took the deal. It went sideways almost immediately, and in 1204, the Crusaders and Venetians turned around and sacked Constantinople itself, one of the greatest cities on earth, looted and burned by fellow Christians. The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered. The Fifth Crusade, 1217, briefly captured the Egyptian port of Damietta before collapsing. The Sixth Crusade, led by the excommunicated Arabic-speaking Emperor Frederick II, is maybe the strangest one of all. He skipped the fighting entirely and negotiated Jerusalem back through diplomacy in 1229. But time was running out. In the early 1200s, the Mongols exploded out of Central Asia under Genghis Khan and his successors, and the shockwaves reshaped the entire region. Mercenaries sacked Jerusalem in 1244, ending the Crusader hold on the city for good. Baghdad fell to the Mongols in 1258, ending the 5-century-old Abbasid Caliphate. There was even a brief moment where Christian Europe and the Mongols considered teaming up, but it fell apart when the Mongols were defeated by Egypt's new rulers, the Mamluks, at Ain Jalut in 1260. The Mamluks, former slave soldiers who just seized power in Egypt, spent the following decades systematically dismantling what was left of the Crusader states. In 1291, after a brutal 6-week siege, the last major stronghold, Acre, finally fell. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land, after nearly 200 years, was over. Calls for new crusades kept coming into the 1300s, but nobody in Europe was listening anymore. They were too busy fighting each other. The Templars and Hospitallers relocated to Cyprus. The Hospitallers went on to conquer Rhodes, while the Templars were dissolved by the Pope in 1312. But the story wasn't really over. As the 1300s rolled on, a new power was rising, the Ottomans. And almost like history repeating itself, Europe would once again find itself desperately trying to unite against an advancing Muslim empire, kicking off a conflict that would run for the next 400 years.